This is John Michael Greer's Decline and Fall, the End of Empire and the Future of Democracy in 21st Century America. This was published in 2014. And I am going to start on Chapter 3, page 53, America at Zenith. I'm using a customized equalizer setup that looks like first a peak at the base, rising and then going down to below 0 in the mid-range, and then up about halfway on the high end. I'm going to raise the high end just a tad so it's still below the peak of the base level. Which is up at about plus 15 decibels. America at Zenith, Chapter 3, Decline and Fall by John Michael Greer. It is a source of continuing irony that so many people on the leftward end of American politics today act as though America's current empire is unique in the history of the world, either in scale, malevolence, or some combination of the two. In any form, this notion is impressively absurd, and it presupposes an equally impressive ignorance of history. Still, I've come to think that there may be an unexpected factor behind that bit of historical blindness, the complete inability of most Americans today to take Britain seriously. Americans these days, by and large, think of Britain in much the same terms as the British think of Luxembourg, a darling little country, quaint and colorful, of interest mostly as a destination for tourists. Oh, and they're stuck in a strategic position, poor dears, so we had to send the troops over there a few times, didn't we? If the technology existed to project the average American's notions about Britain onto a screen, you'd see a giddy collage of Big Ben, Beefeaters, Mary Poppins, Monty Python, half-timbered houses, ivy-covered castles inhabited by ivy-covered aristocrats, Her Majesty the Queen imitating everybody's grandmama as she waves to the crowd, and a mishmash of misremembered history in which King Arthur, Robin Hood, the other Queen Elizabeth, and maybe a blushing war bride or two all jostle one another against the backdrop of a green, pleasant, and very small land. Skipping ahead, it's out of reach because until quite recently Britain was not a cute little country. It was an arrogant, ruthless, rapacious global hyperpower with the world's largest and most technically sophisticated military machine and the largest empire in human history. Around a quarter of the world's land surface and roughly the same fraction of the human race was ruled outright from London, and anyone in the empire who objected to this state of affairs too loudly could expect to have their attitude adjusted by the business end of a Maxim machine gun. The world's maritime transportation routes, then as now, the primary arteries of global trade, existed subject to the whim of the Royal Navy. When patriotic Britons belted out "Rule Britannia," Britannia rules the waves, they were stating the single most important fact of 19th and early 20th century economics and geopolitics. It has become fashionable in recent years among a certain faction of historians to paint the British Empire as a global force for good and a model for all the things to which more recent empires, such as the United States, ought to aspire. In reality, though, the British Empire exercised its power with a breathtaking amorality. Consider the Opium Wars in 1839 to 1832 and from 1856 to 1860. Britain bombarded civilian targets along the Chinese coasts and followed this up with a full-scale invasion, not once but twice, to force the Chinese government to reverse its decision to ban the import of opium and try to control what was then a pervasive and hugely destructive drug problem in China. To the British, the fact that British merchants could make plenty of money at China's expense by selling opium to Chinese addicts was enough to justify what, even by today's loose standards, was an unusually blatant abuse of power. That's not a part of British history discussed much these days, nor, for that matter, is it usually remembered that concentration camps were used by the British with great enthusiasm and a substantial death toll during the Boer War of 1899 to 1902. Now, of course, it's only fair to say that this is how all the European empires of the 19th century behaved. Britain had far and away the biggest empire, but its behavior was no worse than most and notably better than some. It is equally fair to note that as the age of European empire peaked and began its decline, the first two non-European nations that began to establish significant empires, the United States and Japan, didn't behave any better. Empire is a brutal business, and the notion that moral considerations ought to guide the behavior of the great powers is usually a talking point declining empires wield as a means of criticizing the rising powers that will eventually supplant them. This last point, however, is getting well ahead of our story. I'm going to end there on page 56.